The chamber doors sealed behind me with a sound like a held breath being locked away, and I understood, in that single moment, that I was now the only human being inside a room built to judge my entire species. My name is Mara Voss, and I had spent 6 years as the human liaison to the Galactic Council, sitting through endless meetings about trade routes and mining rights and border disputes between species I had never heard of before I took this job. None of that had prepared me for this. None of that could have. 9 seats rose above me in a circle, each one occupied by a delegate from one of the elder species, the oldest and most powerful civilizations in known space. I had never seen all 9 gathered at once. Not once, in 6 years. The air itself felt heavier, as if the weight of every star system they controlled had been poured into this single room. The Jethra speaker stood first. Her body was tall and thin, covered in silver scales that caught the light and threw it back in sharp little flashes, like knives catching sunlight. Her voice, when she spoke, did not sound angry. It sounded worse than angry. It sounded certain. "Ambassador Voss," she said, and my name in her mouth felt like a verdict already delivered. "You represent a species that has existed among the stars for less than 100 years. In that time, your people have expanded faster than any species we have ever observed. You have armed yourselves faster than any species we have ever observed, and you have refused, again and again, to explain why." I stood very still. My hands were folded behind my back so no one would see them shake. "I am listening," I said, because that was the only safe thing to say. "You will do more than listen," the speaker replied. "The council has reached its decision." A murmur passed through the chamber, a low sound made of 9 different languages all reacting at once, and somewhere underneath the noise I felt my own heartbeat pick up speed. I had known this day was coming. Every liaison before me had warned me it would come eventually. I had simply hoped it would not be my turn when it did. "Humanity will submit full control of its weapons research to council oversight," the speaker announced. "Humanity will halt all further expansion beyond its current borders. And humanity will submit to psychological evaluation of what this council has termed unregulated cognition, the unpredictable and unstable nature of human thought, which this council believes poses a danger to galactic stability." I felt the blood drain from my face, but I kept my expression steady. Unregulated cognition. They were talking about the way humans think, the way we solve problems, the way we refuse to follow patterns other species considered obvious and unbreakable. They wanted to study us like a disease. "You have 1 solar cycle to comply," the speaker continued. "If humanity refuses, this council will impose a full quarantine on your species. No trade, no travel beyond your home system, no contact with any other civilization until such time as the council deems your species safe." The word safe hung in the air like poison gas. I opened my mouth to respond, and then I closed it again, because I realized, with a cold drop in my stomach, that I had no authority to answer for 8 billion people. I was a liaison. I carried messages. I did not make decisions for an entire species standing at the edge of extinction by committee vote. "I will relay this to my government," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. The speaker's scales flashed again, and this time I understood the gesture. It was something like amusement. "Of course you will," she said. "We have seen this before with younger species. First comes the message, then comes the panic, then comes the surrender, dressed up in whatever words make it easier to swallow." Laughter rippled through the chamber, quiet, controlled, the kind of laughter that comes from beings who have never once doubted their own superiority. One delegate, a broad creature from a species I only vaguely recognized, leaned toward another and said something I could not translate, but I did not need the translation. The tone told me everything. They thought we were finished. They had already decided how this would end. I stood there and let them laugh, because there was nothing else I could do, and because some small, stubborn part of me, the same part that had gotten me through 6 years of watching my species be talked about like a problem to be managed, refused to let my face show anything except calm. When the chamber finally quieted, the speaker addressed me one final time. "You may return to your quarters and send your message, Ambassador Voss. The Council looks forward to Earth's answer." I bowed my head, the smallest gesture of respect the situation demanded, and turned to leave. My legs felt strange beneath me, as if they belonged to someone else, someone calmer, someone who had not just watched 9 ancient civilizations decide the fate of every human being alive. The walk back to my quarters on Threshold Station felt longer than it had ever felt before. The corridors were built for a dozen different body shapes, all sharing the same passageways, and normally I found something comforting in that strange mix of alien architecture. That day, it only made me feel smaller. Every species I passed seemed to already know what had happened in that chamber. Word traveled fast on a station like this. A few of them looked at me with something that might have been pity. A few looked away entirely, as if humanity's fate was something too uncomfortable to witness directly. I reached my quarters, sealed the door, and sat down at the small terminal built into the wall. My hands were shaking now. I let them. There was no one here to see. I opened a secure channel back to Earth, the kind reserved for messages that could not wait, the kind that cost more resources to send in a single transmission than most people would earn in a year. I typed slowly, choosing every word with care, because I knew this message would be read by people who would decide what happened next to everyone I had ever loved. I wrote out the ultimatum exactly as the speaker had delivered it. Full weapons oversight. A complete halt to expansion. Psychological evaluation of every human mind the Council considered unstable, which was, as far as I could tell, all of them. 1 solar cycle to comply, or a quarantine that would cut humanity off from the rest of the galaxy entirely, perhaps forever. Then I added my own words at the end, the only part of the message that was truly mine. "They believe we will panic," I wrote. "They believe we will beg or bargain or break. Send instructions. I do not know what to tell them, and I am afraid of what happens if we wait too long to answer." I sent the message, and then I sat in the silence of my quarters, staring at the wall, waiting for a response that I knew would take hours to arrive, even with our fastest relay systems. I thought about my mother, back on Earth, who had never once understood why I took this job so far from home. I thought about the quiet nights I used to spend as a child, watching the stars from our back porch, never imagining that one day I would stand in a room where those same stars belonged to beings who saw my entire species as a problem waiting to be solved. I thought about the way the speaker had said unregulated cognition, as if human thought itself was a flaw in the design of the universe, something to be corrected, something to be controlled. And underneath all of that fear, something else began to stir in me, something I did not expect. A small, quiet certainty buried under the panic that the Council did not understand what they were dealing with. They had studied our weapons and our ships and our borders, but they had never truly studied us. Not the way we studied ourselves. Not the way we had survived ice ages and plagues and centuries of war among our own kind, always finding a way through, always finding a way forward, long before we ever reached the stars. I did not know what Earth would say. I did not know what instructions would arrive in my inbox in a few hours' time. But some part of me, small and stubborn and refusing to be silenced even by 9 ancient civilizations sitting in judgment above me, began to suspect that the Council had made a mistake. They thought they were delivering an ultimatum to a frightened, desperate species clinging to survival. They had no idea what they had actually done. Outside my window, Threshold Station turned slowly against the black backdrop of space, indifferent to the decision that had just been made inside its walls, indifferent to the fact that somewhere far away, on a small blue world circling an ordinary yellow star, 8 billion people were about to receive the most important message of their entire history. I closed my eyes and waited. The wait, I would soon learn, was the easiest part of what was still to come. The response from Earth did not arrive in a few hours. It arrived 2 full days later, and by the time it reached my terminal, I had convinced myself that something terrible had happened, that the silence itself was the answer, that perhaps Earth had no answer at all. I was wrong, but not in the way I expected. When the message finally appeared on my screen, it was almost insultingly short. No lengthy explanation, no formal diplomatic language, no instructions on how to negotiate, how to plead, how to buy time. Just a single data packet, sealed with a level of encryption I had never seen used on a routine liaison channel, containing a set of coordinates, a specific date and time, and 4 words. Ask us in person. I stared at those words for a long time, certain I had misread them, certain there had to be more hidden somewhere in the file. There was not. That was the entire message. Coordinates, a timestamp, and a request that sounded almost like an invitation, except it was aimed at 9 of the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy, all of whom had just spent an entire session deciding whether my species deserved to exist freely among the stars. I did not know whether to laugh or to be sick with worry. Some part of me did both at once. News of the response spread through Threshold Station faster than I could have imagined. I do not know how the other delegates learned of it so quickly, whether through their own intelligence networks or simply through the kind of gossip that travels between species who have shared this station for decades. By the time I was summoned back before the council, every alien face I passed in the corridors seemed to already know what Earth had said, and the reactions ranged from confusion to open mockery. A delegate from a species with 4 eyes and a voice like grinding stone stopped me in the corridor outside the chamber. I did not know him well, only that his people traded heavily in rare minerals and rarely bothered speaking to humans at all. "Your people are either very brave or very foolish," he said, his 4 eyes studying me the way one might study an insect caught in a jar. "Ask us in person, as though the council owes your species an audience on your terms." I did not answer him. I was not sure what answer would have been safe to give, and besides, I was too busy trying to understand the message myself. Inside the chamber, the mood was different from what it had been 2 days earlier. The speaker's scales did not flash with amusement this time. Instead, there was something sharper in her posture, something that told me the council had not expected this particular reply and did not entirely know what to make of it. "Ambassador Voss," the speaker said, "your government's response is unusual. Explain yourself." "I do not have further instructions beyond what was sent," I said honestly. "My government asked that this council meet a human delegation in person at the coordinates and time provided." For what purpose? I hesitated, because in truth, I did not know. I had spent the last 2 days trying to guess, and I had come up with nothing that made sense. Surrender did not require a meeting. A formal request for more time did not require secret coordinates. Whatever Earth intended, it was not something that fit neatly into the patterns the Council expected from a frightened, cornered species. "I believe," I said carefully, "that my government intends to answer your ultimatum directly, rather than through a written response." The speaker studied me for a long moment, and I felt, for the first time since arriving on Threshold Station years earlier, a flicker of genuine uncertainty pass across an alien face that had always seemed carved from absolute confidence. "Very well," she said finally. "The Council will honor this request. A delegation will meet your representatives at the specified location, at the specified time. But understand this, Ambassador Voss, whatever your government intends, it will not change the terms already given. Compliance, or quarantine. There is no third option." I bowed my head and said nothing, because there was nothing useful left to say. That night, alone in my quarters again, I found myself thinking back on things I had almost forgotten, memories buried under years of diplomatic training and careful, practiced calm. I remembered stories my grandmother used to tell me about the years before the world had come together, back when nations spent decades preparing for troubles they hoped would never come, building shelters underground, storing away supplies, training entire generations for disasters that sometimes arrived and sometimes never did. She used to say that humans were strange that way. We did not panic in the face of a threat. We planned, we prepared, we built quiet, careful contingencies long before anyone else believed they were necessary, and we kept building them even after the immediate danger had passed, because some part of us always understood that safety was never permanent. I remembered learning, as a child, about the long centuries when parts of our world had been locked beneath sheets of ice, and how our ancestors had not simply waited for the ice to melt. They had adapted. They had moved. They had found ways to survive in conditions that should have ended them entirely, and they had done it slowly, patiently, without the kind of desperate scrambling the Council seemed to expect from us now. I began to understand, sitting there in my quarters with the weight of an entire species pressing down on my shoulders, that perhaps Earth's silence over the past 2 days had not been indecision at all. Perhaps it had been calculation. Perhaps somewhere back home, people far more informed than I was had simply been finishing preparations that had begun long before this ultimatum was ever delivered. I did not know the details. I was not cleared for the details. But the small, stubborn certainty that had first appeared in me 2 days earlier, the sense that the Council had made some fundamental miscalculation about the species they were dealing with, grew stronger with every hour that passed. The day of the meeting arrived faster than I expected. I was given a seat aboard the Council's own transport vessel, a massive ship built from technology far beyond anything humanity had ever produced, and I spent the journey to the rendezvous coordinates in near total silence, surrounded by delegates who occasionally glanced my way with expressions I could not fully read. When we finally dropped out of transit at the specified location, I felt the entire bridge crew go quiet. I moved to the nearest viewport and looked out at what awaited us, and for a long moment I could not process what I was seeing. 3 ships, only 3. Not the massive fleet some of the delegates around me had clearly expected, ships bristling with weapons meant to threaten, meant to intimidate, meant to prove that humanity could stand toe-to-toe with the Council through force alone. These were smaller vessels, sleek and quiet, with a strange, almost unfinished look to their hulls, as if function had been prioritized over every other consideration. I heard quiet laughter behind me, the same kind of laughter I had heard in the chamber days earlier. A delegate near the viewport murmured something to a companion, and though I could not translate every word, the meaning was clear enough. They believed those 3 ships confirmed everything the Council had already assumed, that humanity was small, unprepared, and desperate, that we had come to this meeting not with strength, but with the illusion of strength, 3 lonely vessels sent to save face before an inevitable surrender. I said nothing, but I found myself studying those 3 ships more closely than anyone else on that bridge, and something about their design nagged at the edge of my memory. I had seen ships like this before, in classified briefings years earlier, during my early training as a liaison. Ships built not for combat, but for something else entirely. Ships built to survive absolute isolation, absolute silence, absolute cold, for years at a time without support from any outside system. My stomach tightened as pieces began falling into place, though I still could not see the full shape of what was coming. The Council delegates around me continued their quiet mockery, confident in a judgment they had already made long before those 3 ships had even become visible on their sensors. I stayed silent, watching those small, quiet vessels drift closer through the black, and for the first time since this entire ordeal had begun, I felt something other than fear settle into my chest. I felt the beginning of hope, cold and careful, and entirely my own. The docking sequence took longer than expected, and I spent every minute of it standing near the viewport, watching those 3 human ships align with the massive Council vessel like small, patient animals approaching something far larger than themselves without any visible fear. When the airlock finally cycled open, I was the first one waiting on the other side, and I felt my chest tighten as the first human boots I had seen in years stepped onto that deck. The envoy who walked through was not what anyone in that boarding bay expected. I certainly had not expected him. He was an older man, perhaps in his 60s, with gray hair cut short and practical, and hands that looked rough with years of work rather than years of politics. He wore no uniform, no ceremonial robes, nothing that marked him as a figure of authority in the way the Council delegates around me were used to seeing. He wore simple work clothes, the kind of clothing someone might wear on an engineering deck rather than in a chamber of galactic power. His name, I would learn moments later, was Daniel Hartley, and he introduced himself not as an ambassador, not as a general, but as an engineer. The council delegates around me exchanged glances, and I understood exactly what those glances meant. They had expected a diplomat, someone trained in the careful language of negotiation, someone who might beg or bargain or attempt some clever trick to delay the inevitable. Instead, they were faced with a man who looked as though he had walked straight off a construction site, calm and unhurried, studying the alien architecture around him with quiet, professional interest rather than fear. "Ambassador Voss," Hartley said, extending a hand toward me, and I shook it, grateful beyond words to see a familiar face after so many days surrounded by beings who saw my species as a problem to be solved. "Good to finally meet you in person. You have done fine work these past years, holding this position alone." I did not know how to respond to that kindness, not in a place like this, so I simply nodded and gestured toward the waiting council delegation. The speaker herself had come aboard the transport vessel for this meeting, standing at the center of a small circle of council representatives, her silver scales catching the artificial light of the boarding bay in sharp, cold flashes. "You are the human delegation," she said, and there was something almost impatient in her tone, as though she found this entire meeting beneath the dignity of the moment. "Where is the rest of your fleet?" "This is the fleet," Hartley said simply. A ripple of quiet amusement passed through the gathered delegates, and I felt my face flush with something between embarrassment and anger on behalf of my species. The speaker's scales flashed with unmistakable satisfaction. "3 vessels," she said. "Humanity sends 3 vessels to answer an ultimatum delivered before the full council. Is this meant to be a demonstration of strength, Ambassador Hartley, or is it simply the truth of your species' limitations?" Hartley did not seem bothered by the question at all. If anything, he seemed faintly amused himself, though his amusement carried none of the sharp edge I had heard in the speaker's voice. "These 3 ships were never meant to demonstrate strength," he said. "They were built to demonstrate something else entirely. May I explain?" The speaker gestured for him to continue, though her posture made it clear she expected whatever came next to be another sign of human desperation. "These are called endurance vessels," Hartley said. "We built the first of them almost 15 years ago, and we have continued building more every year since. They carry no weapons worth mentioning. Their hulls are not designed to withstand attack. They are designed for something the Council may not have fully considered when drafting its ultimatum. They are designed to survive complete isolation." I watched the speaker's expression shift slightly, though I could not yet tell whether it was confusion or the beginning of concern. "Complete isolation," Hartley continued, "from trade, from contact, from any outside resource whatsoever, for periods of 10 years or more. Closed-loop life support, self-sufficient power generation, onboard manufacturing capable of producing spare parts and supplies indefinitely, so long as raw material remains available, which, in the depths of an asteroid field or the outer edge of an unclaimed system, it generally does." The chamber, or rather the boarding bay, had gone quiet enough that I could hear the low hum of the ship's systems beneath the silence. "Why," the speaker asked slowly, "would your species need vessels capable of surviving complete isolation for 10 years? Hartley's expression did not change, but something in his voice shifted, becoming quieter, more direct. "Because we have studied your council's history," he said. "We have studied what happens to young species who refuse your terms. We know of at least 4 civilizations that were placed under quarantine in the past several centuries, cut off from trade, from travel, from contact with any other species, left to survive entirely on their own resources within their home systems. I doubt many humans outside of classified intelligence circles had known this. I watched several of the delegates shift uncomfortably, and I understood, in that moment, that Hartley had just said something true, something the Council did not enjoy hearing spoken aloud in front of witnesses. 2 of those species," Hartley continued, "eventually resumed contact with the wider galaxy after several generations, weakened and reduced. The other 2 did not survive their isolation at all. Their systems fell silent, and to our knowledge, the Council never investigated why." The speaker's scales had gone very still, no longer flashing with amusement or satisfaction. "Your species is well informed," she said carefully. "We had many years to research your council before we ever made formal contact," Hartley said. "We understood, long before this ultimatum was ever delivered, that a moment like this was likely to come eventually. A species that grows quickly, thinks unpredictably, and refuses to easily explain itself will always eventually draw this kind of attention from a council built to maintain careful, predictable order. So we prepared, quietly, over many years, for the day this meeting would happen." I watched the delegates around me exchange glances again, but this time there was no laughter in them. The confidence that had filled that boarding bay only minutes earlier had begun to drain away, replaced by something far more careful, far more uncertain. "These 3 ships," Hartley said, gesturing back toward the airlock behind him, "are not our fleet, Speaker. They are simply the closest examples I could bring to show you in person, so that you would understand what I am about to tell you, rather than simply reading it in a report you might dismiss as bluff or exaggeration." "And what?" the speaker asked, her voice quieter now than I had ever heard it. "Are you about to tell me?" Hartley looked around the boarding bay slowly, meeting the eyes of every delegate present, before finally settling his gaze back on the speaker herself. "I am here to tell you," he said, "that humanity has already prepared for the possibility that this council might choose quarantine over cooperation. We began preparing for that possibility years ago, long before your ultimatum was ever delivered, and I am here to show you, calmly and without threat, exactly what that preparation looks like." The silence that followed felt different from every silence I had experienced since arriving on Threshold Station days earlier. It did not feel like the silence of fear. It felt like the silence of an entire room recalculating everything it thought it understood. I stood there, watching the speaker's scales catch the light in slow, uncertain flickers, and I understood, with a strange mixture of pride and quiet dread, that whatever happened next in this boarding bay would change everything the council believed about my species, forever. Hartley did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply reached into a small case carried by one of the 2 humans standing quietly behind him, a woman named Alice Turner, who I would later learn was one of the lead engineers behind the Endurance Vessel program, and he produced a small data slate, offering it toward the speaker without any hint of ceremony. "This contains the projections my government asked me to share with you today," he said. "I would ask that your council review it carefully before making any further decisions." The speaker took the slate, and one of her aides quickly connected it to the boarding bay's main display, projecting the contents into the open air above us in a wide, glowing field of data that every delegate present could see clearly. I watched the numbers scroll past, and even with my limited technical background, I understood enough to feel a chill settle over me. Population sustainability under full isolation, projected at 94% survival across 3 generations. Closed-loop agricultural systems already operational within the asteroid belt of our home system, capable of feeding several million people indefinitely without any outside resources. Independent manufacturing capacity sufficient to replace every piece of technology currently imported from Council trade routes within 8 years, without any loss of critical infrastructure. And then, near the bottom of the display, a section that made several of the delegates around me go very quiet. 6 generational vessels, already constructed and crewed, currently stationed at the outer edge of our home system, each one capable of supporting a self-sufficient population of 12,000 people, for a minimum of 100 years, without any contact whatsoever with any other civilization. "These vessels were not built in response to your ultimatum," Hartley said quietly, as the delegates studied the data hanging in the air before them. "They were built over the past decade, quietly, as a precaution against exactly this kind of situation. We did not build them because we expected the Council to threaten us. We built them because we studied the history of every young species that has ever stood in this position, and we understood that whether the threat came from your council or from somewhere else entirely, a species that depends completely on outside trade for its own survival is a species that can always be controlled through the threat of losing that trade. The speaker's aide, a smaller creature with pale, luminous eyes, leaned toward her and whispered something urgently. The speaker did not respond immediately. She simply continued staring at the projected data, her silver scales completely still now, none of the earlier flashes of amusement or superiority anywhere to be found. "You are telling me," the speaker said slowly, "that your species could survive complete quarantine indefinitely." "I am telling you," Hartley said, "that we have prepared for that possibility as thoroughly as we are capable of preparing, and that our projections suggest we would not merely survive it, but continue growing, continue developing new technology, continue expanding within our own system, entirely independent of anything your council controls." "And if our projections are wrong," the speaker said, a note of something sharp returning to her voice, "if your species collapses under isolation the way others have collapsed before you?" Hartley did not flinch from the question, and I found myself holding my breath waiting for his answer. "Then we will have lost everything," he said simply. "But speaker, I would ask you to consider something else. Even if your council's quarantine succeeded perfectly, even if it cut us off from every trade route and every outside contact for the next century, you would still be left with a species that spent that century building, adapting, and preparing in complete isolation, driven by nothing except the desire to survive on our own terms. When that century ended, whether through our efforts or simply through time, you would eventually be facing a humanity shaped entirely by struggle, entirely by independence, and entirely without any goodwill toward the civilization that isolated us in the first place." The boarding bay fell into a silence so complete that I could hear the faint hum of the ship's engines beneath the floor, could hear my own heartbeat pounding steadily in my ears. "You are suggesting," the speaker said, "that your species intends to become something the council cannot control, regardless of what we decide today." "I am suggesting," Hartley said, "that my species has already decided what it intends to become, regardless of what this council decides today. The only question that remains is whether that future includes cooperation with the council, or whether it happens entirely without you." I watched the delegates exchange glances across the boarding bay, and for the first time since I had arrived on Threshold Station, I saw something in their expressions that I recognized immediately, because I had felt it myself only days earlier, standing alone in that great chamber while 9 ancient civilizations decided the fate of my species. I saw uncertainty. I saw the beginning of fear. "Your government," the speaker said finally, "sent you here not to negotiate, but to demonstrate that negotiation is unnecessary." "My government sent me here," Hartley said, "to make certain the council fully understood the situation before making a final decision. We are not here to threaten anyone. We have no interest in conflict with your council or with any other species. But we will not submit our weapons research to outside oversight. We will not halt the growth of our species to satisfy fears that our thinking is too unpredictable for your comfort. And we will not allow our survival to depend entirely on the goodwill of any outside power, no matter how ancient or how powerful that power might be." The speaker was quiet for a long moment, and I found myself watching her closely, searching her alien features for any sign of what she might decide. "You understand," she said finally, "that this council has never before encountered a species that responded to an ultimatum in quite this manner." "I understand," Hartley said, "that most young species the council has encountered before us built their entire civilization around dependence on outside trade and outside protection, which made your ultimatums effective, because the alternative to compliance was a slow, painful decline into weakness and eventual collapse. My species built something different. We built independence first, quietly, patiently, over many years, precisely because we suspected a moment like this would eventually arrive. I thought, standing there in that boarding bay, of every story my grandmother had told me as a child, every memory of a species that had never simply waited for disaster to strike before preparing for it, a species shaped by ice ages and hardship and centuries of learning to survive on nothing but its own stubborn persistence. I understood. watching the speaker's silver scales catch the light in slow, careful movements, that the Council had spent 6 years studying humanity's weapons, and our borders, and our expansion, and had never once considered studying the quiet, patient work happening in the shadows of our own solar system, the work of building a species that could survive without them entirely. The Council will require time to consider this information, the speaker said finally, her voice carrying none of the confidence it had held only minutes earlier. Of course, Hartley said. Take whatever time you require. We are, as I hope this meeting has demonstrated, a very patient species. I caught the faintest suggestion of something almost like humor in his voice as he said those final words, and despite everything, despite the fear that had followed me through every hour of the past several days, I felt something loosen in my chest, for the first time since this entire ordeal had begun. The speaker turned and left the boarding bay without another word, her aides following quickly behind her, and one by one, the other delegates dispersed as well, murmuring quietly among themselves in languages I could not fully understand, though their tone had changed entirely from the confident mockery I had witnessed only hours earlier. Hartley turned toward me once the boarding bay had mostly emptied, and for the first time since he had stepped through that airlock, his expression softened into something almost like a smile. "You did well, Ambassador Voss," he said quietly. "Holding this position alone, for as long as you have, facing all of this without any support, I imagine it has not been easy." "I did not know," I said, my voice quieter than I intended, "about any of this. The ships, the projections, none of it." "Very few people did," Hartley said. "We could not risk word reaching the Council before we were ready to reveal it ourselves. I am sorry you were left in the dark for so long. It was not meant as a lack of trust in you personally. It was simply the safest way to protect the information until the right moment arrived." I nodded slowly, understanding even as something in me still ached at the thought of those long, frightened days spent believing my species had nothing prepared, nothing planned, no answer at all, beyond whatever desperate instructions might eventually arrive from home. "What happens now?" I asked. Hartley looked out through the nearest viewport, toward the vast, star-filled darkness beyond the ship's hull, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. "Now," he said finally, "we wait and see whether the Council is wise enough to recognize what has just happened here today. And if they are not, Ambassador Voss, then we simply continue doing exactly what we have always done, quietly, patiently, one careful step at a time, until the day comes when no ultimatum from any council anywhere in this galaxy carries any weight over our future at all." I looked out at the same dark expanse of stars, and for the first time since the speaker had first spoken those cold final words in that great chamber, I felt something other than fear settle into my chest. I felt, quietly and carefully, the first true stirrings of hope. The Council took 11 days to reach its final decision, and every one of those 11 days felt longer than the entire 6 years I had spent serving as humanity's liaison combined. I remained aboard Threshold Station during that time, watching the corridors around me shift in ways I had never witnessed before. Delegates who had once ignored me entirely now stopped to ask careful, probing questions about human technology, human history, human intentions. Others avoided me completely, as though simply standing near me might somehow associate them with whatever decision the Council was about to make. The four-eyed delegate, who had mocked Earth's response outside the chamber days earlier, now nodded to me quietly whenever we passed, saying nothing, but the nod itself felt like an acknowledgement of something that had shifted between us. Daniel Hartley remained on Threshold Station as well, along with Alice Turner and the small team that had accompanied him, though the 3 endurance vessels themselves had returned to human space shortly after that first meeting, their purpose already served. I spent much of those 11 days in quiet conversation with Hartley, learning, piece by piece, the fuller story of everything that had been happening back home, while I stood alone in that council chamber, utterly unaware of the depth of preparation already underway. He told me about the early years of the Endurance Vessel program, how it had begun quietly, almost as a theoretical exercise among a small group of engineers and strategists who had studied the Council's history and grown concerned about the pattern they found there. He told me about the asteroid belt settlements, built slowly over a decade, designed from the very beginning to require nothing from outside trade routes. He told me about the generational ships, massive and slow and patient, built not for exploration in the traditional sense, but as a promise to future generations that humanity would never again find itself entirely dependent on the goodwill of any single outside power. "We are not opposed to cooperation," he told me one evening, as we sat together in the small human quarters set aside for our delegation. "We never wanted conflict with the Council, or with any other species, but cooperation only works when it happens between equals." Ambassador Voss. "It cannot survive when one side holds all the power to starve the other into submission simply by withdrawing support. So we built ourselves into something that could never be starved. Once that was done, real cooperation finally became possible, on terms that did not require us to give up who we are." On the 12th day, I was summoned back before the full council, and this time, Hartley walked beside me into that great chamber, along with Alice Turner and 2 other members of our delegation. The chamber felt different than it had 11 days earlier. The speaker still stood at the center of the assembled delegates, her silver scales still catching the light in sharp little flashes, but something in her posture had changed, something quieter, more measured than the cold certainty I had witnessed during that first terrible meeting. "Ambassador Voss," she said, and this time my name did not sound like a verdict. It sounded almost like a question. "Ambassador Hartley, the Council has reached its decision." I felt my heartbeat quicken, and beside me, I noticed Hartley's expression remain perfectly calm, as though he had already guessed what was coming. "The Council withdraws its previous ultimatum," the speaker said, and a murmur passed through the chamber, though this time it did not sound like mockery. It sounded like the sound of an entire room recalculating everything it thought it understood, just as it had in that boarding bay 11 days earlier. "Humanity will not be required to submit its weapons research to Council oversight. Humanity will not be required to halt its expansion, and the matter of what this Council previously termed unregulated cognition will be struck entirely from any future proceedings involving your species." I felt something release in my chest, a tension I had been carrying for so long that its absence felt almost disorienting. "In its place," the speaker continued, "the Council proposes a new framework for future relations with humanity, one based not on oversight, but on mutual agreement. One that acknowledges your species as an independent power within this galaxy, rather than a young civilization requiring guidance or correction." I glanced at Hartley, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw something like quiet satisfaction settle across his weathered features. "The Council understands," the speaker said, and there was something almost like reluctant respect threaded through her voice now, "that humanity's preparation over the past decade has demonstrated a level of independence this body has not previously encountered among younger species. We recognize that any attempt to enforce our previous demands through quarantine would likely fail to achieve its intended purpose, and would instead produce exactly the outcome your delegation warned us of 11 days ago. A humanity shaped entirely by isolation and entirely without goodwill toward this Council afterward." Hartley stepped forward then, and the entire chamber seemed to hold its breath as he spoke. "On behalf of my government," he said, "I want to be clear that humanity does not wish for isolation from the wider galaxy. We built our independence not because we sought to withdraw from contact with other civilizations, but because we understood that meaningful contact could only happen once we were no longer vulnerable to threats like the one delivered in this chamber 11 days ago. We are prepared to discuss trade, cooperation, and shared research with this Council, on equal terms, whenever your body is ready to engage with us as equals rather than as subjects awaiting correction." The speaker was quiet for a long moment, and I watched her silver scales settle into something calmer than I had ever seen from her before. "The Council accepts these terms," she said finally, "and Ambassador Voss." I straightened, surprised to hear my own name spoken directly. Your government's decision to leave you stationed here, unaware of the full scope of their preparations, was, I imagine, a difficult burden for you to carry alone, the speaker said. Yet you conducted yourself with dignity throughout this entire process. Even while facing judgment, you could not fully answer. The Council recognizes that dignity and extends its respect to you personally as well as to the species you represent. I felt a lump rise in my throat, unexpected and entirely unprofessional, and I simply nodded, unable to trust my voice in that moment. In the weeks that followed, I was granted new authority as humanity's official representative to the Council, no longer simply a liaison carrying messages between two sides who barely understood each other, but an ambassador with genuine standing, genuine voice, genuine power to shape the terms of humanity's place among the stars. I stood again in that great chamber many times after that first terrible meeting, and each time, I found the atmosphere subtly different from what it had been during those first frightening days. The delegates no longer spoke of humanity as a problem requiring correction. They spoke instead of a species that had quietly, patiently, without announcement or threat, built itself into something the Council could no longer control through fear alone. I often thought back to that very first day, standing alone in that chamber, watching 9 ancient civilizations decide whether my species deserved to exist freely among the stars, certain that I had no power to answer for anyone but myself. I understood now that I had been wrong about one thing, though right about everything else. I had believed, in that frightened moment, that Earth's answer would arrive too late, that our silence meant indecision, that we had nothing prepared beyond desperate hope. I had not understood, not fully, until I watched Hartley step through that airlock with nothing but calm words and quiet data, that humanity had already answered the Council's ultimatum years before it was ever delivered. We had answered it the same way we had always answered every threat throughout our long, difficult history, not with panic and not with surrender, but with patient, careful preparation, undertaken quietly, far from the sight of anyone who might try to stop us before the work was finished. The Council had wanted to see whether humanity would break under pressure, whether we would beg or bargain or collapse the way other young species had collapsed before us. Instead, we had simply shown them, calmly and without a single raised voice, that we had already built ourselves into something that could never be broken that way again. And as I stood in that chamber, months later, delivering humanity's first formal proposal for equal trade and cooperation, to a council that now listened with genuine attention rather than cold judgment, I understood that this was only the beginning. Whatever challenges still lay ahead for my species among the stars, we would face them the same way we always had, quietly, patiently, and always several steps ahead of anyone who underestimated us.